Over 3,000 years ago, before the age of Rome, before even the mighty empires of Greece reached their height, an island in the heart of the Mediterranean rose to unexpected prominence. Sardinia, rugged, windswept, and encircled by waters as clear as glass, was home to one of the most enigmatic civilizations of the Bronze Age. A people who built in stone on a scale so vast, so enduring, that even today their works dominate the Sardinian landscape. Scattered across the island are the remnants of nearly 10,000 massive stone structures. Some stand alone as solitary towers, others cluster together in sprawling complexes that resemble miniature citadels. Their thick walls and imposing shapes call to mind the castles of medieval Europe, yet they predate those by more than 2,000 years. By the time the first stones of these nuraghi were laid, the pharaohs of Egypt still reigned, and the Hittite Empire thundered across Anatolia. By the time the last were still in use, Rome itself was already casting off its kings and stumbling into the age of the Republic. The people who built these towers are remembered today as the Nuragic civilization, named after the monuments themselves, nuraghi. For centuries they dominated Sardinia, a vital crossroad in the central and western Mediterranean, through trade, warfare, and the sheer persistence of their culture. Some scholars suggest they may even have been among the mysterious Sea Peoples who ravaged the eastern Mediterranean in the 12th century BC, battering Egypt, Anatolia, and the Levant as the Bronze Age world collapsed. If true, then the nuraghi stand as mute witnesses to one of history's most turbulent upheavals. And yet, despite thousands of these towers still standing silent, weather-beaten, their stones warmed by the Mediterranean sun, the truth of their purpose remains tantalizingly obscure. Were they fortresses? Homes of tribal chiefs? Temples? Symbols of prestige carved into the very bones of the island? The earliest archaeologists who examined them had little doubt. To them, these were Bronze Age castles, military strongholds bristling with warriors, lords, and retainers. But recent studies complicate this picture. Some researchers now argue that many nuraghi may have functioned more as elaborate status symbols, residences for extended families, or ceremonial gathering spaces. Their narrow staircases, thick walls, and oddly shaped rooms do not always lend themselves neatly to a purely defensive interpretation. So who were these people who raised towers of stone without mortar, who could command the labor of entire communities for projects of such scale? When did they emerge? Why did they persist for over a millennium? And what finally brought their age of towers to an end? To answer these questions, we must travel back into the very heart of Bronze Age Sardinia. But before we descend fully into their world, it is worth pausing for a moment to take in the stage upon which this story unfolded. Sardinia itself is a jewel of the Mediterranean. It lies just west of the Italian peninsula, a rugged and mountainous island shaped by millennia of volcanic upheaval and shifting seas. Its coasts are alternately dramatic cliffs and gentle bays, scattered with coves and beaches that look today like untouched fragments of paradise. Inland, wide basaltic plateaus rise like fortresses of stone, broken only by winding rivers and valleys. To ancient peoples, these landscapes must have felt both forbidding and protective, isolated from the wider world, yet central enough to touch the trade routes that bound together Spain, Italy, North Africa, and the distant Aegean. It is little wonder that Sardinia developed a culture unlike any other. Archaeologists who walk its hills today find layer upon layer of history pressed into the soil. Neolithic tombs, Bronze Age villages, Roman fortresses, and medieval castles all sharing the same ground. The nuraghi are only the most dramatic expression of a land where human hands have built, shaped, and dreamed for countless generations. For the modern visitor, Sardinia is often celebrated for its natural beauty, its turquoise waters, its warm winds, its ancient forests of cork oak. But beneath that surface lies a past as dense and complex as the stones of a Nuragic wall. To walk among these towers is to feel the weight of millennia pressing close, to hear echoes of voices that spoke in languages long lost, to stand in the shadow of something both familiar and alien. The Nuragic story is not simply about architecture or warfare. It is about identity, how a people understood themselves, how they anchored their authority in stone, how they projected power and memory across generations. Their towers are the bones of their civilization, each one a statement carved against time itself. And so, as we begin to follow their trail, keep this thought in mind. Each Nuragic you see standing today, whether crumbling in a field or looming proudly over a plateau, was once alive with the rhythms of daily life. Fires burned within their dark interiors. Footsteps echoed on spiral staircases, children played in their shadows, and chiefs looked out from their heights across the lands they claimed. The mystery of the Nuragic people begins here, in the quiet grandeur of their stone towers. But to understand how these marvels came into being, we must first look to their origins, the birth of the earliest Nuragic, when Sardinia was just beginning to carve its place in the great drama of the Bronze Age world. The Nuragic civilization takes its name from the towers themselves, Nuragic, though no one can say with certainty where the word comes from. Some scholars propose a Semitic root, perhaps linked to the Phoenicians and Carthaginians who later controlled the island. Others suggest Indo-European or even Latin origins, imposed by Roman chroniclers centuries later. Still others point to the shadowy Paleo-Sardinian language, the tongue of the island's first farmers. The truth is lost in time, hidden behind the silence of an unwritten past. What we know is simpler. The word, like the stones, has endured, while the meaning slipped away. The first Nuragic appeared around 1800 BC. They were not yet the great round towers that dominate the Sardinian landscape today, but something more modest, though still extraordinary for their time. Archaeologists call them proto-Nuragic or corridor Nuragic. Their design was long and narrow, their interior spaces shaped like passageways, almost like tunnels carved in stone. From above, some were round, others oval, and still others more angular. Their walls were astonishingly thick, built in layers, a neat exterior facing of carefully laid blocks, an interior lining, and a core of rubble and earth to bind them together. Within those massive walls ran stairways, leading up to flat-topped platforms where timber structures once stood. The wood, of course, has long since vanished, but faint traces remain stone sockets where wooden posts once braced roofs and beams. From these traces, we can almost imagine the creak of planks, the smoke of a fire rising through the gaps, the watchful eyes of a family or a sentry looking out across the hills. But why were they built at all? Here, the debate begins. Some argue these earliest Nuragic were refuges, places for local villagers to flee in times of danger. Others see them as watchtowers, standing guard over valleys and pastures, signaling from one to the next across the rugged landscape. Their narrow stairways and small doorways, their defensive thickness, seem designed with security in mind. To live within them permanently would have been difficult. The interiors were dark, cramped, and smoky. Perhaps people lived in small huts nearby, retreating inside only when raiders appeared on the horizon. And yet, others disagree. To them, these towers were homes impressive, prestigious, built as much to display authority as to withstand attack. The tiny doorways and narrow stairways were not necessarily defensive but structural necessities, keeping the great stone walls from collapsing under their own weight. Physics, not fear, dictated their form. It is hard not to feel that somewhere between these two visions lies the truth. Sardinia, in the Bronze Age, was not a land of peace. Across the Mediterranean, populations were expanding, resources contested, and warfare all too common. It seems natural to imagine that the Nuragic people, like their contemporaries in Mycenae or Hatti, built with danger in mind. And yet, they also built with pride, with an eye to how their towers loomed above the land, projecting power to friend and foe alike. Around 1600 BC, a transformation occurred. The Proto-Nuragi gave way to a new architectural marvel. The Tholos Nuragi, the classic towers that still define the Sardinian skyline. Here, the builders abandoned timber upper floors and flat roofs. Instead, they reached upward in stone itself, creating towers that sometimes rose 2 or 3 stories high. Their method was the corbel dome, each layer of stone slightly overlapping the one beneath it, narrowing the space until it could be capped by a single slab. This ancient technique, used in tombs and monuments across the Mediterranean, found new expression in Sardinia. The result was monumental towers, some over 18 meters tall, their bases wide and solid, their walls up to 5 meters thick. From a distance, they looked like colossal beehives of stone. Up close, they seemed impregnable, the work of giants. Many of these towers, archaeologists believe, once bore small domes atop their staircases, even adorned with early versions of machicolations, projecting stone parapets with openings through which defenders might hurl rocks or shoot arrows at attackers. Such features would not appear in medieval Europe until the Crusades, more than 2,000 years later. And yet here, on Sardinia, the Nuragic builders were experimenting with them in the 2nd millennium BC. Ahead of their time, or simply drawing upon innovations from neighbors in Iberia, Italy, or even Greece? We may never know. To the first archaeologists who stumbled upon them, there could be no doubt these were castles. They imagined Bronze Age lords ensconced in their towers, ruling over peasants, defended by warriors, a vision of proto-feudalism rising centuries too early. Later scholars, more cautious, pushed back. The Nuragic society, they argued, was not nearly so stratified. These towers may not have been castles in the medieval sense, but community projects, the result of villages pooling their labor under the guidance of local chieftains. And yet, however we interpret them, the Nuragi remain astonishing feats of engineering. Imagine the effort, hauling massive basalt or granite boulders from quarries, sometimes dragging them hundreds of meters, sometimes kilometers. Constructing ramps of earth to roll each block into place, the towers rising layer by layer. Hundreds of hands, countless hours, generation after generation, carrying forward the craft. The landscape itself became a quarry, a workshop, a stage for monumental ambition. Inside, the Tholos Nuragi were no less striking. Their circular rooms often contained deep wall niches, whose function remains uncertain. Were they cupboards for storage, alcoves for sleeping, or shrines for offerings? We cannot say. Fires were lit in central hearths, smoke seeping slowly through the stonework or out narrow exhaust windows cut into the walls. Spiral staircases wound upward, almost always beginning to the left of the entrance. To the right, a niche waited first. Archaeologists called it the God's Chamber, imagining sentries demanding, "Who goes there?" Perhaps it was merely a cloakroom, a place to hang weapons or store grain. Perhaps it served all of these purposes across centuries of use. Whether defensive strongholds, aristocratic dwellings, or communal symbols of identity, the Nuragi multiplied, thousands of them. Built in highlands and valleys, from basalt, granite, limestone, schist, whatever stone lay close at hand. Most drew upon materials found within a few hundred meters, though sometimes heavier blocks were hauled from further afield. Wherever they rose, they reshaped the horizon, each one a declaration. Here we stand. This land is ours. By the late Bronze Age, Sardinia was a forest of towers. From the sea, a foreign sailor might glimpse them crowning the hills like stone sentinels. From the valleys, farmers and herders lived beneath their shadows. And for the people of Sardinia themselves, the Nuragi must have been more than simple shelters. They were markers of identity, rallying points for clans, enduring symbols of permanence in a world of shifting alliances and constant struggle. The stage was set. But as centuries passed, the towers themselves began to change, evolving from simple structures into something far more complex, vast fortresses of stone, with multiple towers, walls, and courtyards. These were no longer just towers. They were castles in truth, among the largest and most sophisticated in the Bronze Age world. By the dawn of the Iron Age, around 1000 BC, the Nuragic world had already begun to change beyond recognition. The great fortress towers still stood, but their role was shifting. The population had declined, villages had grown in prominence, and the energy once devoted to raising monumental stone was now turned to daily survival. Into this changing landscape sailed new arrivals. The Phoenicians, merchants from the Levant, began to plant colonies along Sardinia's coasts. Their sleek ships carried glass, fine pottery, dyes, and exotic goods. In return, they sought metals, copper, silver, lead, that Sardinia's hills could provide. The Nuragic people must have watched them with both fascination and suspicion. At first, contact may have meant trade and opportunity, but slowly, the coastal enclaves became footholds of power. By the 9th century BC, Sardinia was no longer an isolated world of towers. It was part of a wider Mediterranean economy dominated by outsiders. When the Phoenicians gave way to Carthage, the dynamic shifted again. Carthaginian settlers pressed deeper inland, clashing with local communities. By around 500 BC, Carthage controlled much of the island, imposing its rule and transforming Sardinia into a frontier of its empire. Yet even under foreign domination, the Nuragic legacy endured. The towers, still useful, became storerooms, workshops, even stables. Some were incorporated into new settlements, others were left to crumble, their stones cannibalized for walls and houses. Then came Rome. In 238 BC, during the First Punic War, Sardinia was seized by the Republic, becoming Rome's second province. For the next 7 centuries, Roman roads, villas, and garrisons spread across the island. But still, the Nuragi were not erased. Some villages persisted around them into the late Roman period. Farmers kept animals in their ancient chambers, grain was stored in their cool interiors, and the towers continued to mark the Sardinian landscape as they had for 1,000 years before Rome's legions ever arrived. By late antiquity, many Nuragi were abandoned, yet even then they remained symbols. With the spread of Christianity, some towers were baptized into the new faith, given the names of saints, or incorporated into the grounds of early churches. Their circular forms inspired Christian architecture, their stones reused in sacred buildings. The Nuragic legacy thus passed quietly into Christian Sardinia, reshaped but never forgotten. And here lies one of the most extraordinary facts. Despite 3 millennia of storms, earthquakes, and human neglect, thousands of Nuragi still stand today. Their dry stone walls, built without mortar, have outlasted empires. The very absence of mortar allowed them to breathe and flex, shifting with time rather than shattering. What medieval castles required masons and cement to achieve, the Nuragic builders had mastered with little more than stone, gravity, and patience. When you walk among them today, the effect is haunting. Some rise proudly, nearly intact, their corbelled domes still arching overhead. Others lie in ruin, heaps of massive blocks half buried in earth. Yet whether whole or broken, each whispers of lives lived long ago, of chiefs and farmers, of children playing in the courtyards, of warriors sailing east to fight in lands they had never seen. The Nuragic people left no written records. Their names, their songs, their myths, all are lost. And yet, in their towers, they carved a memory so enduring that it still defines Sardinia itself. To this day, the Nuragi are symbols of Sardinian identity, appearing on coins, logos, and monuments. They are reminders that the island's history is not merely a reflection of Rome, Carthage, or Phoenicia, but a civilization all its own, one of the most mysterious and fascinating of the ancient world. Perhaps the Nuragic people never imagined that their towers would endure for thousands of years. Perhaps they built only for themselves, for their children, for the strength of their clans. Yet, what they left behind stands among the most remarkable architectural achievements of antiquity. They built proto-castles 2,000 years before medieval Europe. They developed defensive techniques long before they were invented elsewhere. And above all, they proved that even a people without kings, empires, or written words could leave a legacy in stone that the world still struggles to understand. Today, archaeologists continue to excavate, debate, and reinterpret these towers. Were they fortresses, palaces, temples, or symbols? The answer may be all of these at once. Human history is rarely simple. What is certain is that the Nuragi were at the center of Sardinian life for over a millennium, evolving as the society itself evolved, until they became less a tool of survival than a monument to memory. When you stand before one today, on a lonely plateau or beside a modern village, you cannot help but feel the echo of ages. The stones are silent, but the silence speaks. It tells of ambition and survival, of decline and persistence, of a people who built something that time could not erase. The Nuragic civilization is gone, but its towers remain watching, waiting, enduring, echoes of stone in the heart of the Mediterranean. By around 1350 BC, Sardinia's landscape of solitary towers was undergoing a transformation. The Nuragi no longer stood only as single beacons of stone. Across the island, chiefs and their communities began linking towers together, building walls that encircled courtyards, creating complexes that sprawled like miniature citadels. The age of simple towers was giving way to something far more imposing: the fortress Nuragi. It may have begun simply enough. A local chieftain, seeking to expand his influence, added a second tower beside the first. Then, perhaps another, connected with walls. Soon the design spread. Central towers flanked by satellites, enclosed spaces where families, warriors, and livestock might gather in times of danger. From these modest beginnings, Sardinia's Nuragi evolved into some of the most remarkable fortifications in the ancient world. Some sites developed gradually. Layers of stone and effort added generation after generation. Others appear to have been planned as complexes from the start. Monumental projects requiring immense organization. In either case, the result was astonishing. Fortified centers that could rival, in ambition, if not in scale, the citadels of Mycenae or the palaces of the Near East. To build such complexes demanded more than muscle. Skilled architects must have overseen construction, calculating weight and angle, ensuring walls stood firm. Communities had to provide food, tools, and labor for months, perhaps years at a time. This was no casual work of villagers piling stones. These were undertakings of social will, testaments to a society that could command loyalty and resources on a grand scale. What drove this leap forward? Archaeologists can only speculate. Perhaps population pressures mounted, disputes over land and pasture sparking conflict. Perhaps certain chiefs grew richer through Sardinia's place in the Bronze Age trade networks routes that carried copper, tin, amber, and precious goods across the Mediterranean. With wealth came ambition. With ambition, fortresses. The Nuragi became more than homes or watchtowers. They were symbols of chieftainly power, physical embodiments of authority. Yet, even at their height, Nuragic leaders never seem to have ruled like the great kings of Egypt or Mycenae. They were not emperors commanding armies over vast territories. More likely, they were powerful local chiefs, their influence extending across valleys and plateaus, woven into a patchwork of tribes. The fortress Nuragi marked the centers of these domains, stone hearts of tribal networks. Among the hundreds of sites that still dot Sardinia, one stands apart: Nuraxi di Barumini. Rising on the Central Plains, it is today a UNESCO World Heritage Site, excavated, preserved, and studied in depth. Nuraxi tells the story of Nuragic evolution in miniature. At its core lies a massive central tower, nearly 19 meters high when first built around 1600 BC. Later generations added 4 satellite towers, linked by thick walls. Courtyards filled the spaces between, while beyond them, a village of round huts spread outward like ripples on water. Over centuries, more towers, walls, and structures were added, until the complex became a veritable stronghold of stone. Nuraxi was not alone. Across Sardinia, Fortress Nuragi rose in number. Some may have reached heights of 20 or even 30 meters, nearly 100 feet, dominating their landscapes as surely as medieval castles would millennia later. And unlike many ancient ruins, these fortresses were not isolated monuments, but living centers, surrounded by villages of huts where farmers, herders, and craftsmen made their lives. The Nuragi were not only fortresses, they were focal points of community, where politics, ritual, and daily life intertwined. Within these stone strongholds, life must have been complex. Archaeologists have found wells within walls, suggesting that some sites were prepared for siege, their inhabitants able to endure long periods of isolation. Storage areas hint at supplies of grain or livestock. Yet the scale of the defenses raises questions. Who were the attackers these fortresses were meant to repel? Sardinia was isolated, yet it was never cut off. Traders and adventurers from Iberia, Italy, and the eastern Mediterranean must have arrived on its shores. Were the fortress's defenses against outsiders or against rival Sardinian chiefs locked in endless feuds over land and power? Whatever the case, the fortress Nuragi reflected a world growing more dangerous, or at least more ambitious. And their builders were not isolated primitives, they were connected to the great Bronze Age networks of trade and culture. Sardinia was rich in metals, especially copper and lead, resources coveted across the Mediterranean. In return, Sardinian chiefs may have acquired fine pottery, exotic ornaments, and perhaps even ideas, techniques of architecture, styles of weaponry, glimpses of faraway lands carried back by traders or warriors. It is tempting to compare these Nuragi to the great palaces of Mycenae or Tiryns, with their cyclopean walls and grand gates, or to the citadels of the Hittites, their fortified cities rising in Anatolia. Sardinia was not so different, an island people, building their own vision of strength in stone, reflecting both local needs and global currents. But no monument, however grand, exists in isolation. Around 1200 BC, the wider Mediterranean world was shifting. Climatic stress, famine, earthquakes, migrations all contributed to a wave of collapse that swept away mighty kingdoms. The Mycenaeans fell, the Hittites crumbled, Egypt itself staggered under assault. Into this maelstrom came raiders known as the Sea Peoples. Among them, if Egyptian records can be believed, were the Shurdan warriors with horned helmets, whose name echoes with Sardinia itself. Here lies one of history's great mysteries. Were the Shurdan the Nuragic warriors, sailing east to seek fortune and conquest? Or were they outsiders who later lent their name to the island? Either way, the turbulence of the late Bronze Age did not spare Sardinia. Its Nuragi endured, but their role and the society that built them began to change. The towers still stood, the villages still thrived. But a new chapter was about to begin, a chapter of transformation, decline, and adaptation. The year was around 1200 BC. Across the Mediterranean, storm clouds gathered not of weather alone, but of history. Great powers that had stood for centuries began to falter. The palaces of Mycenae, once proud, were abandoned or burned. The Hittite Empire, with its chariots and scribes, collapsed into silence. Egypt, the eternal kingdom of the Nile, fought for survival against waves of invaders. The world of the Bronze Age was unraveling. In this chaos, ancient records speak of marauding groups known collectively as the Sea Peoples. They came by ship, striking at the coastlines of Anatolia, Syria, and even Egypt itself. Among them, one group stood out in Egyptian inscriptions, the Sherdun, warriors depicted with horned helmets and round shields. Their name has echoed down the centuries, for many believe the Sherdun were Sardinians, the very people who built the Nuragi. If this is true, then the Nuragic warriors were not merely defending their island. They were voyaging eastward, fighting as raiders, mercenaries, or conquerors in the heart of the Bronze Age collapse. Egyptian reliefs show them captured and pressed into Pharaoh's service, their distinctive helmets unmistakable. Imagine it. Sardinian chieftains and their followers, sailing across the sea, drawn by wealth and battle, never to return. But whether they left their island in force, or whether outsiders imposed their presence on Sardinia, the result was the same. The society of the Nuragi began to change. Back home, the towering fortresses lost their primacy. The great complexes were not abandoned overnight, but their role shifted. Villages grew in number and importance, spreading across the island, their huts clustering in circles around central courtyards. Life became more communal, less focused on the fortress towers. Within these villages, new structures appeared. Round meeting halls with stone benches circling the walls, sometimes with basins or altars at their centers. Archaeologists call them rotundas, and they suggest something remarkable. Instead of power flowing from a single chieftain, these meeting houses may have embodied a new form of collective rule. Councils of elders, gatherings of clan leaders, or ritual assemblies could have taken place here. In the center, a basin of water, or perhaps beer or wine, might have served for libations, feasts, or rituals of unity. Imagine the scene. Men and women seated on the benches, passing cups around, debating, worshiping, binding their community together through shared drink and shared decision. Religion, too, transformed. Sacred wells and springs became focal points. Sardinia is rich in underground water, and the Nuragic people built astonishing sanctuaries to honor it. Subterranean chambers lined with precision-cut stone, stairways descending into darkness where cool water glistened. These were not crude constructions. They were masterworks of Bronze Age engineering, their geometry precise, their atmosphere profoundly sacred. To enter such a sanctuary must have been to step into another world, a place where the human and the divine met. The shift from fortress to village, from tower to temple, reveals a society adapting to new realities. Perhaps the great chieftains had gone east as Sherdun warriors, their power broken in foreign wars. Perhaps internal strife or famine weakened the old order. Whatever the cause, by 1000 BC, the Nuragic world was less about fortresses and more about community life, ritual, and survival. And yet, the Nuragi themselves did not vanish. They endured as silent witnesses, their chambers repurposed. Some became granaries, storing grain against lean years. Others sheltered livestock or served as workshops. In some, feasts were held, fires burning once more in the ancient hearths. The towers, though no longer centers of power, remained woven into the fabric of daily life. Archaeological finds from this period suggest a rich cultural life persisted. Bronze figurines appear in abundance, tiny warriors with horned helmets, animals, ships, and gods cast in exquisite detail. These were not toys but votive offerings, left in sanctuaries or within Nuragi themselves. They speak of a people who still honored their ancestors, who saw the towers not only as stone shelters but as sacred monuments linked to their identity. It is easy to draw a comparison here with Egypt or with the Maya, civilizations whose great monuments outlived the societies that built them. For the later Nuragic people, the towers of their forefathers must have seemed almost superhuman, feats beyond their own diminished capabilities. They lived among giants, and the stone reminded them of what once had been. But even as Sardinia adjusted, new powers were stirring across the sea. The Phoenicians, masters of trade, began to establish coastal settlements by the 9th century BC. Carthage, their great colony, would eventually cast its gaze on Sardinia as well. The Nuragic people, though still present, found themselves increasingly caught between foreign influences and their own traditions. The age of independent Nuragi was fading, yet the story was not over. The towers would endure, changing roles again and again, as new conquerors came and went.